The cold came back on a Tuesday. That was the thing about late March in that part of the country. It would offer you a few warm days, just enough to make you believe, and then pull everything back, like a hand retracting a gift it had never meant to give. The false thaw had lasted 4 days, long enough for the mud to soften along the fence lines, long enough for the first thin green to push up through the dead grass along the south-facing slopes, long enough for men to start talking about soil temperatures and early planting at the feed store. Then the temperature dropped overnight. The sleet came in off the northwest, and by Tuesday morning the county roads were glazed with a thin skin of ice that caught the headlights and gave nothing back. He had been up since before 5. That was not unusual. The old man moved through his morning the way he always moved, slowly, carefully, with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that carelessness in the cold cost more than carelessness in the warmth. He checked the water lines in the barn. He broke the ice in the stock trough with the back of a splitting maul. He drank his coffee standing at the kitchen window, watching the gray light come up over the east field, without any particular enthusiasm, the way a man watches weather he has already accepted. By 6:15 he was in the truck. The 1974 rust-red pickup had a heater that worked on its own terms, which meant the left side of the cab warmed faster than the right, and the cracked passenger side mirror threw a fractured image of the road behind him that he had long stopped trusting. He turned the engine over twice before it caught, let it idle for a few minutes while the defrost worked at the windshield, and then pulled out onto the county road heading east. The radio came on with the engine. AM, the only station he bothered with, already mid-broadcast, the announcer's voice flat and unhurried with the particular calm of a man delivering news he knows nobody wants to hear. Temperatures not expected to recover before the weekend at the earliest. Overnight lows staying in the upper 20s through Thursday, with the possibility of additional freezing precipitation Wednesday evening. Farmers are advised. He turned it down but not off, left it as a low presence in the cab, a voice keeping the silence company. 5 more days. He had heard it. He let it settle in the way he let most hard information settle, without reaction, without argument, just down into the place where facts were stored and held until they became useful. The road ahead was empty. The fields on either side sat flat and colorless under the low sky, every surface wearing its coat of ice, like a skin it hadn't asked for. A crow sat on a fence post and did not move as the truck passed. The county had the look of something waiting to be told what came next. He came around the long bend where the county road dipped before the old Hendricks crossing, and that was where the headlights caught it. Pale, low to the ditch line, a smear of something that did not belong to the ice or the mud or the gray-brown tangle of last year's dead grass along the shoulder. He eased off the accelerator. Behind him, the other truck, the 2 younger men from the property adjoining his east fence line, who had been behind him since the feed store, slowed as well, their headlights pushing his shadow long across the road ahead. He stopped, put it in park, left the engine running. The ditch on the right side of the road was flooded from the melt and then frozen half over again, a shallow channel of gray water with a skin of new ice at its edges, where the temperature had fallen back in the night. The pale shape was in the water, several pale shapes, moving or trying to. He got out. The cold came at him immediately, without politeness. He walked to the shoulder and stepped down into the frozen grass and crouched at the ditch edge. And then he understood what he was looking at. Goslings, Canada goslings, newly hatched. He could see that in the way they were made, the soft darkness of their down, darkened further by the water. The tiny heads that were too large for the weight of their bodies. They were bunched together in the shallow flow, pressed into a mass the way small things press together when the only warmth left is the warmth of each other. Most of them were still. The water moved faintly around them, licking at the ice shelf at the ditch's far edge. He did not count them then. There were many, more than he would have expected to find in a roadside ditch in the last week of March, in this cold. On this particular morning, when nothing was supposed to go differently than it had the day before. He heard the window of the truck behind him come down. One of the younger men called out to him. The voice carried the particular kind of certainty that belongs to people who have not yet gotten out of a warm cab. "Those birds are gone, old man. You can see it from here. Leave them alone." He did not answer. The second voice followed, shorter, less patient. "Not worth your time." He was still crouching. He looked at them, at the stillness of them, the small mass of feathers and cold water, and whatever was left of whatever had brought them this far. His hands were already cold, hanging over the edge of the ditch. He was looking for something specific, the way a man looks when he already knows what finding it will cost him, and he is only waiting to see whether it is there. He waited. The county road held its silence around him. Then he saw it. A beak. One small beak, opening and closing in the cold air, with the kind of effort that costs something. Slow, barely there, the way a flame moves when there is almost no oxygen left to feed it. It was enough. He did not stand up immediately. He stayed crouched at the edge of the ditch with his hands hanging over them, and looked for another moment, not in doubt, but in the particular stillness of a man who is confirming what he has already decided. The beak moved again. That was all it needed to be. He stood up slowly. His knees had their own opinion about cold mornings and crouching in frozen ditches, and he gave them a moment before he turned back toward the truck. He went around to the bed and pulled out the wooden crate he kept there for no fixed reason. The kind of thing a man accumulates over decades of farm work, objects that have outlived their original purpose, and wait patiently for the next one. He set it in the road beside the ditch. Then he took off his coat. The younger men in the truck did not say anything at first. They watched him pull the olive-drab field coat off his shoulders and hold it open in the freezing air, and perhaps they were too surprised to speak. The cold came in against his shirt immediately, the way it always does. Not gradually, but all at once, as if it had been waiting for permission. He did not hurry. He reached into the ditch with both hands. He worked carefully and without ceremony. He lifted them in small groups, 4 or 5 at a time, the weight of them almost nothing, and he laid them into the coat. His hands moved the way they always moved when they were doing something that mattered. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of attention that turns a task into something else entirely. He could feel the cold soaked into them, the absence of warmth, but he could also feel the small, irregular movements of the ones that were not entirely still. He did not count them yet. That would come later. One of the younger men said something from the truck window. He couldn't quite make it out and did not turn around to ask. He folded the coat over the Goslings in the crate, tucking the heavy canvas sides down around them, the way a man tucks in whatever is fragile and cold and not yet finished with the world. Then he lifted the crate and carried it to the cab. He set it on the passenger seat. The cracked mirror on that side caught the gray morning light and held it badly. He pulled the door shut, started the engine, and let the heater run. He did not look at the 2 younger men before he pulled away. He did not explain himself. The decision had already been made, not that morning, not in that ditch, long before. The barn was cold when he arrived, but cold in the way barns are cold, not hostile, just indifferent, holding the temperature of the night before, the way stone holds it. He had the heat lamp down from the shelf before he'd fully removed his boots, the cord uncoiled with the habitual efficiency of a man who had done difficult things in the dark before and knew that speed was not the same as hurry. He set the lamp low over a bed of loose straw in the corner stall, close but not too close. He'd seen young birds scalded by well-meaning heat before. The distance mattered. Everything at that hour mattered, in ways that were hard to explain to someone who hadn't stood in a cold barn with 40 failing creatures and understood that the margin between enough and not enough was narrower than it looked. He lifted the goslings from the crate one by one and laid them in the straw beneath the light. Some moved as he touched them, some did not. He filled the dropper from a jar of water he'd warmed on the wood stove and worked down the row, pressing a slow bead of water against each tiny beak, waiting, moving on. He did not rush. Rushing was a form of panic, and panic had never once helped anything he'd encountered in this life. The night was long. He lost track of how many times he rose from the low stool he'd pulled to the corner, checked each bird with a careful hand, refilled the dropper, adjusted the lamp angle by an inch. The barn was quiet except for the hiss of the lamp and the occasional shift of his old dog settling somewhere behind him in the dark. He had no radio out here, no clock he could easily see. Time passed in the way it passes during any vigil, unevenly, in long stretches that compressed without warning, and then stretched again. By the time the barn's single east window began to gray, he knew which ones he had lost. He had known, perhaps, for several hours, but he had continued tending them all equally, because the ones still living needed the same attention the dying ones did, and because there was something in him that refused to give a thing up before the night was fully finished. 9. He carried them to the garden in a cloth, and buried them in the far corner where the fence met the stone wall, near where his wife had once grown herbs. The ground was still reluctant, half frozen an inch below the surface, and he worked slowly with the short spade. It did not take long, there was no ceremony. He stood over the small disturbed earth for a moment, and then he was still, and the morning was still around him, and the cold came off the fields in a slow white exhale. 31 remained in the straw beneath the lamp. He went back to them. Word travels the way word always does in a county this small. Not quickly, exactly, but completely. Within 2 days of the storm, the feed store on Route 9 had the shape of it. The old man out on the county road in the sleet, picking up ditch birds, wrapping them in that old coat of his. By the 3rd day, the diner had added the detail that he had driven home with a wooden crate of soaked goslings on the seat beside him, and by Sunday, the church parking lot had the final accounting. 9 dead, 31 alive, and the old man still out there every few hours through the night, checking on them like they were something that mattered. The telling was never cruel in the way that shouting is cruel. It was the other kind, the quiet, tilted kind, where a man's name is said with a certain inflection, and the people listening understand what is being communicated without anything exact being stated. The old man wasted a night. He carried home birds that weren't his. He lost almost a quarter of them anyway, and now he was raising the rest. That word, raising, seemed to be the one that stuck, because it implied intention, and intention implied expectation, and expectation in a thing like this struck people as its own kind of foolishness. They were Canada geese. They were not chickens. They were not a crop. There was no market for them, no ledger line that made sense of the labor, no sensible return on the hours he had poured into that first cold night, or the cold nights that followed. People had been willing to call it soft-heartedness when they thought he was simply nursing the birds through a difficult week. It was the continued commitment that unsettled them, the fact that he had not set the survivors aside and returned to the regular business of a struggling farm, but had kept tending them with the same patient deliberateness he brought to everything else. Spring arrived. The county shook loose of the cold in small increments. A warm afternoon here, a week of mud and then sun there, and the world around the old man's farm began its usual return. Calves appeared in the neighboring fields. Tractors moved again along the ridge roads. The feed store windows got a fresh coat of paint, and the auction house on the county line put up new signage for the spring livestock sale. None of it changed the settled opinion regarding the geese. They would amount to nothing. They were a distraction on a farm that could not afford distractions. The old man had always been a little too willing to spend himself on things that didn't pay back, and this was simply the most recent example of that tendency. A little more visible than usual, and therefore a little more remarked upon, but not essentially different from everything else about the way he had always chosen to work. Spring passed. The geese were still there. The summer that was coming was not. April came in, wet and indifferent, the way it always did in that part of the country, not warming so much as relenting, the cold losing its grip, degree by degree, until one morning you stepped outside, and the air simply no longer argued with you. The old man noticed it the way he noticed most things, without ceremony, without comment, adjusting his routine by small increments, the same way the season itself was adjusting. The 31 geese were growing. There was nothing graceful about it. That was the first thing you would have said if you had been watching, and the neighbor who stopped at the fence one Saturday morning in late April said exactly nothing, because nothing polite was available to say. He stood there with his forearms on the top rail and watched the flock move across the near pasture, if you could call it moving, which was generous. They lurched, they crowded each other, they stopped for no apparent reason and then started again. Their feathers were coming in unevenly, giving each one a ragged, half-assembled look, as though the project of becoming a goose had stalled somewhere in the middle. They were loud in a way that carried no dignity, not honking yet, not properly, something between a croak and a complaint, constant and without rhythm, the sound of creatures who had not yet learned to be what they were going to be. The neighbor watched for a while. Then he shook his head once, slowly, the way a man does when he has been confirmed in something he already believed, and drove away without stopping to talk. The old man had seen him from across the yard. He didn't walk over. He had nothing to explain, and knew better than to try. He tended the geese the way he tended everything else on that farm. Early, before the light was fully up, moving through the morning with the unhurried precision of a man who had learned long ago that the work does not wait and that rushing it does not help. Fresh water, grain measured out and spread, a slow walk through the flock, eyes moving over each bird the way a man checks an engine he knows is running rough, looking for the one that is off, the one that is falling behind. In March, it had been a matter of survival. In April, it was maintenance. The difference was smaller than people imagined. May arrived and the geese were louder still, and more demanding, and no more charming than they had been a month before. They followed him in the mornings now, which was not the pleasant pastoral image it sounds like, when 31 large half-grown geese crowd behind a man carrying grain. It was chaotic, insistent, and hard on the boots. He tolerated it with the same expression he brought to most inconveniences, which was no expression at all. They were alive. He had started that count at 40 and carried it down to 31, and 31 was where it had held. That was the number that mattered. The summer was still coming. June came in quietly, the way trouble usually does. The first week felt like nothing more than a dry spell, the kind of brief tightening that every farmer in that county had learned to read without alarm. Skies stayed clear past the point where clouds should have gathered. The air held a faint, chalky dryness that settled in the back of the throat in the afternoons. The veteran noticed it the way he noticed everything on the farm, which was to say, he catalogued it without comment, filed it where it belonged, and kept working. But the pond was dropping. It was subtle at first. He only confirmed it because he had a habit, begun decades before he could have explained why, of marking water levels on fixed things. There was a flat-faced limestone rock at the pond's near edge, a rock that had been there since before he bought the land, and he knew its waterline by memory the way he knew the height of his own fence posts. In the first week of June, the water fell an inch below where it should have been. In the second week, it fell another inch. He crouched at the rock's edge one morning and looked at it for a long moment, without touching anything, the way you look at a wound you are deciding whether to treat. The pasture grass was yellowing along the low ground first, always the first signal, because the soil there was thin over hardpan and held nothing in reserve. He had planted it sparse this year anyway, knowing the fields were tired, knowing the farm was running on a short margin that did not allow for bad luck. A dry summer was not bad luck exactly. Bad luck was random. This felt more deliberate, the way weather sometimes does when it turns against a particular piece of land. The AM radio confirmed it by mid-June. He heard the report on 2 separate mornings, the announcer's voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who knows the news is unwelcome. Drought conditions developing across the region, below average rainfall for the 3rd straight month, reservoir levels down across 6 counties, and the words that landed with their own particular weight. Could be the driest summer in over a decade. He turned the radio off both times before the segment finished. He had heard what he needed. 11 years, he thought. The last one had been 11 years before. He remembered that summer. He remembered what it had done to the smaller operations in the county. He remembered who had recovered and who had not. He walked his fence line that evening and looked at the fields, the thin grass, the pale sky, the dust that lifted off the lane in a way it should not have been lifting yet. The geese moved along behind him for part of the walk, then peeled away toward the low end of the pasture, toward the clay ground he had never worked, never considered. He did not follow them, not yet, but he watched where they went. The pond told him first. He had been measuring it the old way, a marked stick cut from a cedar post, the kind of tool a man uses when he does not trust what he cannot hold in his hand. He had driven it into the mud at the shallow end back in April, when the water was still full from the spring thaw, and he had checked it every week since. By the 1st of July, the water line had dropped below the 2nd notch, half depth, maybe a little less, depending on the morning. He pulled the stick out, looked at the mud stain on the wood, and put it back without a word. The garden was worse. He had planted it tight that year. Rows of beans, squash, 2 kinds of tomato, onions along the south edge, and the soil that had looked dark and workable in May was now pulling back from itself, cracking in thin lines along the furrows. He had gone to bucket watering 2 weeks before, hauling from the pond twice a day, morning and evening, rationing it out by feel more than measure. He knew the math. He did not write it down. Along the county road, 2 of the neighboring operations had already started hauling water in. He had seen the tanks on the flatbeds going past in the early mornings. Heavy, slow-moving, the kind of sight that means a man has already moved past hoping and into managing. He did not wave when they passed. They did not stop. There was nothing to say that the sight itself did not already say. But the geese were thriving. That was the thing he turned over in his mind in the evenings, sitting on the porch after the bucket runs were done. Everything else on the farm was showing the strain, the grass in the pasture gone pale and brittle, the lane dust thick enough to coat his boots in a single walk. But the geese moved through the heat with an ease that looked almost deliberate. They were big now, fully grown, the white patches on their faces bright against the brown summer grass. They drank from the pond and they ranged widely, and they seemed, if anything, more settled than they had been in June. And every afternoon, in the deepest part of the day's heat, they drifted. It was not dramatic. It was not a march or a rush. They simply moved in their unhurried way, away from the pond, away from the shaded side of the barn, and down across the lower pasture toward the hollow he had always ignored, the low clay ground that never drained right, never grew anything worth cutting, that he had written off years ago as a problem with no solution. They gathered there in the heat of the afternoon and stood together in a loose, quiet group. And then, when the sun dropped, they came back up toward the barn. He watched them go down on 3 separate evenings before he let himself wonder why. 3 evenings became 4. 4 became 5. And on the 5th evening, standing at the fence in the cooling air, he stopped telling himself it was nothing. There was a pattern to it, not a frantic one, not the kind of behavior that announces itself. Just a quiet regularity, the way a thermometer behaves, the way water seeks its level without hurry or complaint. Every afternoon when the heat was worst, the geese moved down to the hollow. Every evening, When the sun began to soften, they came back up. He had watched it enough times now that he could have set his watch by it, if he wore one. He went out the next morning early, before the day had gathered its heat. The air was still and pale, and the dew had already burned off by 7, which told him what kind of day it would be. He walked the lower pasture in the long shadow of the tree line, the dry grass crackling under his boots, and the geese came with him, not following exactly, but moving in the same direction, the way they sometimes did, as if they had their own reasons for going where he was going, and did not need his permission. The hollow looked worse in morning light than it did at evening. The clay had cracked in the heat into a mosaic of hard, flat plates, pale gray at the surface, the edges curled slightly upward, the way old paint lifts from wood. Nothing grew there. The grass around it had gone brown and flat weeks ago. Even the weeds had given up on the hollow, which told him something he had not fully thought through before. Weeds, in his experience, did not give up easily. He stood at the edge and looked at it for a long moment. Then he walked in. The geese stayed at the edge, watching him. 31 of them, quiet in the early light, their white face patches bright, their feet still from their walking. He moved to the center of the hollow and crouched down, the way his knees only let him do slowly now, and he pressed his palm flat against the cracked clay. He held it there. The surface was warm from yesterday's sun. He waited. He pressed slightly harder, feeling the give of the ground, or the absence of it, or something between the two, and there it was. A faint resistance that was not entirely resistance. A temperature that was not quite the temperature of the surface. A suggestion, barely a suggestion, that the ground beneath the hardpan had not fully surrendered to the heat above it. He stayed crouched there for a full minute, hand flat, eyes on the gray clay between the cracks. Then he straightened up, careful with his knees, and he looked at the geese standing quietly at the edge of the hollow in the morning light. He went back to the barn and got a spade. He did not dig fast. He had never dug fast, not even when he was young, and he was not young now, and the July heat pressed down on the hollow like something physical, like a hand flat against the top of his head. He worked in the early morning, before the sun cleared the tree line, and he stopped when the light turned hard and white, and the sweat on his shirt stopped feeling cool. Then he rested in the shade of the hollow's edge, drank water from a mason jar, and waited for the afternoon to soften before he touched the spade again. The geese watched him from the rim. They did not wander far on the days he worked there. They moved around the hollow's perimeter in their unhurried way, grazing, settling, rising again, but they stayed close. He did not know if they were curious about the digging or simply drawn to the hollow the same way they had always been drawn to it. It did not matter. Their presence had become a kind of company he had stopped questioning. The first day he got down 18 inches into the clay, hard going. The hardpan cracked in flat plates and had to be pried loose before the spade could cut again. His back ached before noon. He rested longer than he dug. The second day he went deeper. The clay darkened as he went down, which was something. He knew what darkening clay meant, or could mean, or once had meant on other ground he had worked long ago. He did not let himself think too much about it. He had learned that particular discipline somewhere between the farm and whatever came before it, the discipline of not looking too far ahead, of keeping the work in front of you, and letting the result come, or not come, on its own terms. On the third afternoon, a little past 3 o'clock, with the heat at its worst, and the geese still at the edge, he set the spade into the floor of the hole and felt the resistance change, not dramatically, not like water rushing up to meet him, just a change in what the ground was willing to give. He worked the spade again, gently this time, and turned a small plate of clay, and then he waited, crouched at the edge of the hole with his forearms on his knees. It came slowly, a darkening around the edges of the cut. A film of moisture spreading across the cracked floor of the hole, the way ink spreads on paper, quietly, without announcement, following the cracks, as if it had been waiting in them all along. Then a seep, slow and steady and clear. He did not move for a long time. He stayed crouched there at the edge of the hole, while the water found its level, watching it come, listening to nothing, the geese quiet behind him, the hollow holding the heat of the afternoon around them both, like a room with no walls. He did not celebrate. He did not go inside and call anyone. He stayed crouched at the edge of that hole until the water had risen enough to cup in his palm, and then he let it run through his fingers and stood up slowly, his knees objecting the way they always objected now, and walked back to the barn to find the rubber hose. He had lengths of it coiled in the machine shed, old irrigation hose, cracked in places, patched with electrical tape and sheer stubbornness. He had saved it the way he saved everything, not because he knew what it would become, only because he had learned that the cost of keeping a thing was almost always less than the cost of needing it again. He laid the lengths out in the afternoon sun, fitted them together at the couplings, and by early evening had rigged a hand pump simple enough that a man with sore hands could work it without cursing. The water moved through the hose slowly, the way it had seeped up through the clay, without dramatics, without announcement. He walked the line himself each morning, checking the connections, clearing any kink, and let the seep do what the seep was willing to do. He did not ask more of it than it offered. By the first week of August, the garden had recovered enough that the bean rows stood upright again. By the second week, the grass along the fence line held its color, a thin green hem running the perimeter of his property, while his neighbors' pastures faded to the color of old straw, then to the color of dust. He did not walk the fence line to look at the contrast. He did not need to. The geese moved with the water. They seemed to understand where the wet ground ran, patrolling the fence line in loose formations, grazing the green margins, honking sharply at anything that came close. A neighbor's dog, a stray cat, the county assessor's sedan when it slowed at the road one afternoon. They had grown into something the veteran had not anticipated. Not just a flock, but a perimeter. They knew this farm now the way he knew it, its edges and hollows, and the one corner where the ground still gave. He watched them from the porch some evenings, the hose running quietly along the fence, the barn cooling behind him as the sun dropped. The barn had been hotter than a bread oven all through July, but now that the ground near it stayed damp, the temperature inside had eased. He slept better. The remaining animals settled. He did not think often about the 9 small graves in the corner of the garden, but sometimes in the early morning, when the light was still low and the geese were moving across the wet grass in a long, unhurried line, he stood at the garden fence and let the quiet hold him. The assessor arrived on a Tuesday morning, late in August, when the county roads were still pale with dust, and the sky had been white for 3 weeks running. He drove a dark green sedan with a county seal on the door and a clipboard on the passenger seat. He had been making this circuit for 2 weeks already, farm to farm, loss to loss, writing down numbers in columns that told a story of what the summer had taken. He had seen dry ponds, cracked pastures, cattle moved early, orchards dropping fruit before it was ready. He had not expected much different here. He pulled in at the gate and sat for a moment with the engine running. The fence line was green, not the desperate, pale green of something barely holding on, but a darker shade, the green of ground that had been fed steadily, quietly, from below. It ran along the low side of the property, maybe 40 yards of it, and against the parched gold of the surrounding fields it looked almost impossible. He turned the engine off and stepped out. The veteran was already at the fence. He had heard the car coming from inside the barn, had heard the particular slowness of a vehicle that was looking for something, and he had come out the way he always came out, unhurried, without particular expression, in his faded olive-drab field coat, despite the heat. The geese moved behind him in the low hollow, 31 of them, pulling at the wet grass with the calm authority of animals that belong entirely to a place. The assessor introduced himself. He looked at the fence line, and then at the hollow, and then at the flock. He asked a few questions. The veteran answered them, quietly, without elaboration. The assessor wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at the fence line one more time. He had no category for what he was seeing. He had a column for losses, and a column for partial losses, and a column for complete failures. He did not have a column for a farm that had found its own water in the hardest summer in 11 years, because an old man had noticed where the geese kept going. He thanked the veteran and got back in his car. The veteran stayed at the fence. The geese moved through the hollow in their long, unhurried line, grazing the margins of the seep, patrolling the edge of the wet ground the way they had learned to do all summer. The morning light was still low. The barn stood behind him with its peeling red paint and its old boards dried by the heat, but standing. The farm was still here. He had picked 40 birds up out of the cold in the last week of March. 31 of them had shown him where the water was. He watched them move across the wet grass and did not say anything. He didn't need to.